I'm Kayla Dice, and this is Your Lifepath. I'm an out-of-control tabletop role-playing game designer, and on this show I talk to TTRPG designers and other exciting guests about everything that inspires or influences them away from role-playing. My guest today is one of my favourite illustrators, designers, and writers, is someone I collaborated with on a game before. My guest today is Gormengeist. Hello and welcome to the show.
Hello.
Would you like to introduce yourself a bit more fully?
Yes, I'm Gormengeist, designer, illustrator, etc. Brooklyn, America. I guess, man, I don't know. I'm just around. Like it's not a it's not a big deal to me. Um, I could GREED, claim to fame, freaky OSR shit, and Bubblegum Wizards, all that nonsense. Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
excited to be here. Let's fucking get it.
let's get into it. Yeah, you did Bubblegum Wizards 2, I think, was the first thing I saw of yours. And then
Hmm.
we worked together. You were the illustrator for Terminal. And in that time as well, you released Greed. And we're also going to talk about a bit about an upcoming game you have called All the Aces.
True. One thing about
So,
Bubblegum Wizards, no one knows about Bubblegum Wizards 1. Bubblegum Wizards 1
it's no
is
longer on
like,
your itch, I think, is it?
no, I took it down because it's bad. I made it in like right after high school, and I'm really like I'm kind of pleased that a lot of people know Bubblegum Wizards 2, and I've never gotten like a what's up with Bubblegum Wizards 1. It's like we don't talk about Bubblegum Wizards 1.
Yeah, I think when I first looked on your itch, I remember I couldn't. I might have still been on there at one point, or maybe it wasn't, and I didn't know if Bubblegum Wizards 2 was like, oh yeah, there is a Bubblegum Wizards 1, or I didn't know if it was a sort of like Mountain Goats esque, just like illusion of like other things. I did the same with one of my games though. There is
It's
like,
sick.
and I took the two off it in the end because I just pretend that there was no other
Mm,
first game.
that's a
But
good
yeah,
idea.
it's although also I do like the two. I just then worried it would
Right.
confuse people. But I think you're saying it was actually all clear.
Yeah. There's a couple people. It doesn't, yeah. I like the two as well. I think it adds character.
Yeah. So size of you you live in Brooklyn. Were you born and raised in Brooklyn?
No, I'm from the suburbs outside of New York City, and I'm here
Ah.
mostly for college. Um, but yeah, I've never lived outside of New York State, so I'm a New York baby, but not a Brooklyn baby. But I
That makes
represent
sense.
Brooklyn in the game design scene, not holistically, of course, but I like to imagine that there's some sort of Brooklyn scene that I would be a part of.
Yeah, no, I get that. Like the cutting edge of a Brooklyn scene.
Right, the emerging Brooklyn TTRPG scene.
What was so what's growing up in like the suburbs? I just said suburbs. The suburbs like.
Well, I mean, it's like it's in the shadow of New York City, which is I think pretty interesting. That New York City is this place that everyone knows about all over the world, but it's like a 40-minute train ride away. Um, and so you're going there pretty often, even though it's not where you live. And then, of course, to New Yorkers, it's like you don't fucking live in New York, and you don't. Um, but I don't know. It was interesting to grow up in a place that did have, I guess, with TTRPGs in particular, there was, um, and I imagine this is pretty universal, a real folk TTRPG community in the suburb that had come from like advanced Dungeons and Dragons up through to when I got into it when I was a kid. Um, I started playing 3.5th edition, and that was like I don't know. It was this weird. There's something about the enclaves that form in these suburban comic book shops where there's only one in the county or whatever, or there's only one in the village. So everyone goes there and everyone like learns from the same guy how to play Dungeons and Dragons. And then you get older and it's like that guy had some weird ideas about how to play Dungeons and Dragons. Um, and then I feel like, I mean, I can't speak to it at all in terms of what growing up in New York City would have been like, but I imagine not so much like that. Um, like, because there's more heterogeneity. Uh, but I think it's good to have been exposed to these sorts of folk ways in my youth, and then to have been opened up into choice in adulthood. I think that that's probably the proper order of things.
Yeah, it's interesting because I grew up in a town basically 40 minutes by train from London. So probably not like an identical experience just because of various differences, but like similar. But I didn't get into RPGs until I was um like 21, I think. So
Mm.
I actually don't know what the I imagine there may be a sort of like, yeah, idiosyncratic version of RPGs in the area I grew up in that I just don't know anything about.
I had a like the reason I started designing RPGs was because where I grew up, uh, we would play D&D at the comic book store, and then afterwards, uh, there was this kid who I was friends with who would run his own homebrew games, and we were in middle school, and I don't know, and I've asked him why were you running your own games, and I think he's never given like a good answer. It's always been like, oh, I just didn't really. It just seemed like the done thing, and because we were all in middle school, it was it was this like if you wanted to run, you made your own game. Um, and so we were all like, there was like three or four of us who had a group of middle schoolers who would play our boutique RPGs, and we had no machinations. We had no thoughts about like. I think the first thought I remember having as a game design thought was, I think spell slots are fucking dumb. Like, so I want to cast Fireball. I don't know, in some way that isn't 5 times a day or whatever. Like I wanted to be like, what is there any other way to do it than 5 times a day? That's so lame. And then it's like there. So it's this interesting sort of. I think I became a game designer because of that this bizarrely rich soil. Um, but also, it was a weirdly incurious game design scene. Like we were not playing interesting games. We were playing Dungeons and Dragons, and then our own games, which were mutant Dungeons and Dragons.
But it is, I
Like
do
there
find it
was
really fascinating for that to have sprung up with no, especially like at a young age. I think it's so interesting,
right,
almost like the mutant Dungeons and Dragons, almost as like the twin sibling of like how other types of kids at other places weren't really in on like fanfic of their favorite shows or stuff.
totally. Yes, because I never got into fan fiction or any of that, and I'm a writer now. But I do like we did make these strange like we were really into JoJo's Bizarre Adventure and stuff. So I remember distinctly we would just put everything we liked in the games. We'd be like, there's stands in this game. There's Nen in this game. There's like, and we never released any of them, and it would always like sometimes it was literally like the stands from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure are in this game, like the same ones as the show. Not even your like you could make a new one if you wanted, but like that this was the list. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and those games, I mean, none of them became the games that we play now, and by late high school even I had moved on to the I guess primeval versions of some games that are out now like Nuclear Knights, but and Greed started in high school, but
Oh wow.
yeah, but it was that it's bizarre that that happened. With no, there was no adults telling us to do that or like encouraging it really. And internally, I guess we were just like, yeah, whatever you want to run, I'll play, whatever. And like that manifested as I didn't even think we ever considered buying. Like there was always a shelf of White Wolf, Vampire the Masquerade, all that stuff. Like we never even thought about buying that shit. Uh,
Yeah, it's just like, oh, I want to do a game. Well, I guess the only way to do that is one of us has to come up with it.
right. I think the only time I really broke that rule was with we had a first edition of Gamma World that was in the back of the
Ah,
game shop. That old box with the with the scratchy wobbly font, and I bought it because it just looked sick. And then I ran some Gamma World, and then that Gamma World became Nuclear Knights eventually.
yeah, I was
Just
gonna
like
say that's like a
yeah,
relationship there, isn't there?
my home. I had sort of adopted Gamma World. I was like the one who liked Gamma World and would run Gamma World, and then I just like made my own version of Gamma World that I ran for a long time. And then I was like, I should make this into something that we could actually release. And then I changed it to Nuclear Knights. Um,
So was there like a large period where you were just playing Nuclear Knights, but under the name of like, this is just my Gamma World. This is what Gamma World is
yeah,
now.
yeah. There was a big
That's great.
I had there was a campaign that I often when I run campaigns I split them into seasons a la television and or I used to a lot more. And in high school, I had this Gamma World campaign, which was using a completely boutique system that had very little to do with Gamma World, aside from the just basic facts of it. And then, like over the seasons, that the it got, I kept changing the system until I it was different enough that I was like, I'm just gonna call this something else. And
Yeah.
now it's been so long that we just call it Nuclear Knights. It's weird to call it Gamma World because I think it has its own thing now. It's important to me that the influences are surpassed or not surpassed necessarily, but like that Nuclear Knights has an identity very much aside from Gamma World, but that it is still obviously of that lineage of like OSR style uh, lasers and wizards type deal.
Yeah. Like a like wanting sync where it's like, oh yeah, I want this lineage to be seen, but also as someone making sync, I want to have made something that felt like it came from me. I remember I said like I thought about like the relationship to inspiration on something like Terminal where I was aiming more for like pastiche than fanfic. Not as a judgment
Mm-hmm.
against either of those, but just like an intention in terms of what I wanted to do from design. So
Mm-hmm.
you're designing as a child basically at this point. Did you have any sense of like that as a thing you as a thing I think of all of the stuff I may have done or played around with as a child. Do you remember getting a sense of like, oh, I'll keep doing this as an adult? Do you have an idea of like other things you were wanting to be as a child either?
I was a really serious kid. Um, I was like, I knew by freshman year of high school, I was like, I'm going to be a writer, and I'm going. Before that, I wanted to be a comic artist and or I wanted to illustrate. My plan in middle school was very seriously the following: I was going to illustrate and write my own comics, get big and famous, then direct the movie adaptation of my comics. I was going to do what Katsuhiro Otomo did with Akira. That was my plan because Akira's cool, and that didn't end up happening. And I realized at some point that the thing I really liked doing was the writing and not the drawing. Not that I don't like drawing, but that at some point I was like, I like comics because I like storytelling. and I got impatient. I started wanting to just describe the pictures, uh, and then I started writing. And since then, I think game design still to me, like, I knew I would be doing it when I was an adult because it was, once I had started, an instinct that I could not suppress. Like, to this day, I every once in a while I tell my friends, I'm like, I'm retiring from game design. It's like, because uh, I just feel like the prose and like novels is the thing that I am sort of more seriously in my mind reaching towards. But game design is, and this is, how you live your days, is how you live your life, et cetera, et cetera. Game design is the thing that I do a lot and the things that I release, because it's this unsuppressible urge in me that it's like every time I'm like, I can't, I'm going to take a break for a little while of designing games. And then I watch, I don't know, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and I'm like, shit, that's a game, isn't it? um, and
It
then
is
that's,
like, yeah, a thing that just worms into your head and then can't turn off.
yeah. And like, you know, I'm the sort of person, at least with game design, that I have so many irons in the fire at any given time that it's like my Google Doc fucking folder of games is, I mean, there's like 40 subfolders in there. Uh, and so at any moment I could be like, oh, you know what? Have I made anything that's like actually kind of sick that I forgot about? And then if I go in there, I'll be like, oh, what is this? And then I'll like, do a little bit more of that, and then eventually, like those slowly rolling boulders just sort of get to the bottom of the hill, and then it's like, oh, I can release all the aces. That one's done. Um,
Yeah, but it's in that
yeah.
sense of having so much stuff and just always sort of tinkering and focusing on different things and not necessarily, yeah, like following
Hmm.
this like step plan, but more just like a compulsion almost.
Yes, I would describe it as a compulsion, which I do get it. I get annoyed when artists are like, I can't help myself. Like, because you can. Like, I, like, what is it? Orwell or someone saying that it's like, if you can avoid writing, avoid writing. It sucks. It's like, it doesn't suck. It is fun. And especially it's fun play testing games and seeing mechanics sort of come to life. Uh, like, yeah, it's gratifying work. I would say, and that's what keeps me coming back, is that you put something out and then people will see it. But imagine
I think
that.
in your writing, it really seems obvious to me that you enjoy the act of writing. Um, and I
Thank you.
think I assume that would be self evident about a lot of writers, but I don't necessarily think it is always the case. Like, but yeah, I think in your writing, in your voice, there's a sense of like you're enjoying the medium of the message as well as just the end result.
Well, thank you. I think that that's something I find really important. Of like, why would you make a game if you didn't love the idea of a game? Like, the most fundamental idea of a game, where it's like, I love when I'm watching a movie and it's fascinated by the fact that you can see and hear something at the same time. um, which is like, that's what a movie is. So when you see and hear something at the same time, um, and in a similar way, it's like, I think, I always want to be looking for those moments of like, what about a given piece of writing is happy that it is the written word and not anything else? Or what about a manual? Like, because that's what games are, they're instruction manuals. Like, why does this thing want to be an instruction manual? What a strange thing to want to be. um, like, what sort of voice does that necessitate, in order to be true in a way that makes sense? um, like, that if something doesn't want to be an instruction manual and it is one, then to an extent that it's not true to itself. It's trying to hide from some aspect of itself. And I think that there's a lot of good art that is not true to itself, but I don't think there's any great art that is true to itself. That is not true to itself.
Mm. Do you think have you ever felt like started a thing in one place, either like in other realms of prose, and then been just partway through like, oh, this isn't what it wants to be. Everything needs to get reconfigured out. Now I found the shape of the where the skeleton needs to fit.
Maybe. I think, I mean, generally my games stay games and my, prose stays prose and all that. But I think there's one thing that I have been playing with for a while, which is that the Greed short story, the Greed extended example of play, I've been trying for a while. I think that's a play. I don't think it's a short story.
Ooh.
And I wanted to rewrite that. I'm probably gonna do this at some point, but I wanted to rewrite that as a stage play and like put it up on itch and just like if anyone wants to stage this thing, like good luck. Because I think that there is something very I like a script. I like and a lot of that story is script, and I think that that's where its energy is. And in that way, I guess that's what I would a good way to tell what something wants to be is where its energy is. Um,
Yeah. The things I
and I
remember from
yeah,
that story are in the dialogue exchanges.
thank you. It's really, and I think in the rules, like I think you can tell Greed is a rule book because its funniest things are the rules. Um, like if Greed was just a story about a fucked up place, like it wouldn't be half as interesting. Um,
So you mentioned having this like serious sort of clear-eyed plan of I'm going to be writing this, I'm going to be doing comic book. I wonder if at that age did you consider yourself a writer then, or did you have this idea of I'm going to be a writer?
I think that I did think I was a writer. I I think that I don't know what I would have said if you asked me then, but certainly there's been no moment of realization. It's like I think that bad writers are writers, and I was a bad
Yeah.
writer, and like I was sort of I remember my big thought because so I started writing seriously in freshman year of high school, and by my senior year I had written a shitty novel and I was trying to get it published quite seriously. And I remember thinking like the driving thought that I would return to in moments of doubt was bullshit gets published every day. Like I just gotta slip through the cracks. Um, and now that's a refrain that I fall to less and less because I think it's got maybe um, it would be nice to make something that is not just slipping through the cracks, but is in fact good. Which is and once you've believed in yourself for long enough, it gets easier. But like I think starting out, there is and with game design too, it's like you just sort of do it, and the doing it is yeah, you're one of the people who do it if you do it, and you're
Yeah.
not if you don't. Um, so I would have called myself a writer probably, um, but I think I maybe wouldn't have called myself a game designer until until I made my itch page because
Mm.
I had made the original in high school. I made the original Nuclear Knights game because technically the one on the itch page is Nuclear Knights 2. um,
But that's undeclared.
that one's classified, and the original Nuclear Knights was the first game that I finished and released, and that was complete. Like I would never show that to anybody now. It used D100 for everything. It's there were stats that was like 25, and you added it to a D100. It's just, and like there's nothing interesting going on with that. It had like 20 classes and they were weird and a lot of just bullshit. And and at that point I was like, yeah, whatever. I'll release this and like just and I'll have done it. I released it on Drive Through RPG. The reason I don't, by the
Ah,
way, use Drive Through RPG anymore is that the site is like ugly. That's it. That's
it's
my
really
only
bad.
reason.
I upload things there occasionally, but often forget to. I think I'm like 3 releases out of date. Also, I don't ever publicize the fact I do have anything on Drive for RPG
Mm.
because I hike up my prices to account for the higher cut they take there. So like,
Mm,
if somebody who likes Drive Through, please don't buy my books on Drive Through. You are paying more for it because I'm like, well, I want the same
mm,
amount of money.
right. Yeah, so I released that, and then I think I released the original Bubblegum Wizards on there, and then I don't know why I made a niche page. Really, I must have heard about it somewhere, but by that time, certainly by Bubblegum Wizards 2, I thought that I was doing something. But I think before then, I was just sort of clacking around my mental toys. Um, yeah.
Yeah. I find this an interesting question to ask people because I don't ask it to like privilege the idea of like being a writer as something that like yeah, you're completely right that bad writers are writers. But I guess I just find it interesting people's conceptions of themselves.
Hmm.
And I guess it's maybe something about like process or present tenseness or stuff. But yeah, it's just a question of like self consideration, I find
Yeah, I mean, it's
curious.
also, it's even, knowing a lot of writers now, knowing a lot of people I would consider writers, I think it is such a, um, it is something that you first believe and then happens. Like, no one wants you, except for you, usually, to quote unquote live a writer's life. Like that to be a quote unquote writer is such an active choice uh, in terms of just putting your ideas out there and like seeking things out. Or even if you could just be a writer who writes and then fucking puts everything in a single drawer and locks it every
Yeah.
night. Um, Although I do think that it's a social reality. I do think that it's like you're a writer because you act like one and you write. There's some people who only do one and not the other, and I'm not sure if they count. Um, but I think that it is this sort of social dance that you do, and that includes just saying that you are is
Yeah.
probably the biggest part of it. As with most
Yeah.
things.
It's I found it really interesting as well thinking about other art forms I've done where I remember like because I was briefly a comedian. I was a comedian for like 2 or 3 years or whatever actually. But it
Nice.
was a thing where I was like, yeah, the moment after I'd done a few gigs, I'm like, oh cool, I'm a comedian now. But whereas
Hmm.
I trained to be a wrestler for like a year and a half, and I probably would then only consider myself a wrestler after a first match. Like
I love
that's
that
more a
about you.
timestamp I can do on it. It's my weird facts that are occasionally known. But there's also an interesting thing because I don't consider myself a comedian anymore because I'm like, well, I don't do it. I could,
Hmm.
in theory, and like I could walk onto an open mic tomorrow and then I'd be like, oh, I'm a comedian. But in my mind, it is like a present. It is a there's a
Hmm.
tense to it.
It's more of a verb. I am doing
Yeah,
comedy.
yeah, and I think that about most art, for me at least, and my relationship with most art. I'm aware
Hmm.
other people may have their own things, but going back to you, and I was wondering, some of your games are written in collaboration, and I was wondering if you could talk me through that process for you.
Sure. So, well, so in general, a lot of the games, almost all the games, have at least one credit for a quote unquote design consultant. And I think it's always CXA. My design
Yeah.
partner, CXA, when CXA is credited as a design consultant, that means I made the game, and at some point I was like, "What do you think?" Or we played it together, and he said something of, it's just a sort of we've talked about it. The only one that has truly worked in collaboration is Greed, which here's what Greed is. Here's the Frankenstein that Greed is. CXA wrote the first version of Greed in high school, and it we played it a good deal, and it was very, very mechanically almost entirely distinct from the version that is released. Some of the flavor text is virtually unchanged, um, which I try. So he made it in high school. I got out of high school. I started getting more serious about making games, and we kept playing Greed. Um, I made a new. So the original version of Greed, it's worth noting, was so breakable. Like, it was so out of control. We described it as it's like a cheap plastic toy, the original Greed. It was like, it's cool and it's fun, but we did a campaign where I played a Rhoda priest, and within, I don't know, 4 sessions maybe, that Rhoda priest, because he also allowed, in the spirit of Greed, which I agree with, any sort of game breaking like exploit. Like, if I gave him a heads up about it and then he didn't change the book by the time, game night rolled around, like, it's fair
Yeah.
game. So there used to be, basically, through a series of abilities, by the end of that campaign, this character could say something and it would be true. Like, so, and this was good because, there's an implication in the basis of Greed that someone might save the world someday.
Yeah.
There, where
It's
there's this,
rejected by the voice going like, don't talk
right.
about this, but
No, we only talk about it once, but like, there is this implication that the world can be saved. And so I'm a very contrarian sort of player, I think. Especially back then, I liked making characters that were like, you would think this guy's like this, but I'm going to make a guy who's complete fucking opposite. I made a rotor priest whose goal was to put the world out of its misery. And it became that anything he said was true, and then he destroyed the universe. And then I, sort of reflecting that, made a new version of Greed that didn't have a lot of the exploits. That was like, in game, it was the new universe after
it was you.
my
Oh, so
guy
it's
had,
the green sequel. That's also fun. But
right.
yeah, you
And like,
nerfed Rhoda Priest.
we called it Greed Reloaded, and then I ran Greed Reloaded for a little while, and then CXA sort of took it back and changed it again, and that was Greed Resurrections. And we kept sort of passing it back and forth until one day we still had like a D&D style combat system with like rolls to hit and HP and all that. And for the longest time, I was like, this can't be right. Like, every time we would play Greed, it's like, you have the Bodkin, who's the guy who's good at fighting. But then there's a whole combat system. And he's like the only one who can do shit. And I was like, there's got to be a better way. And there was a couple of different versions of Greed where I tried to make a new combat system and it just didn't make sense, or it didn't work. And then, like, the thing that clicked this version of Greed into being was the combat system that you see today, the attack effects table, in which
Yeah.
every die you roll, which is usually d6, consults the same table, and anything above a 6 instantly kills the target. And anything above an 8 instantly kills them twice.
Yeah, and then obliteration,
Right.
obliteration.
Yeah. Ad infinitum. So that, I thought, the interesting thing about that, this is, I think, the encapsulation of me and CXA's design relationship. CXA will come up with some crazy idea or mechanic. He's the more mathematically minded of the two of us. Some weird way for dice to work, say. And he'll make some draft of a game that is completely absurd, but has a lot of really, really, really great ideas in it, but doesn't really cohere into like how are you going to play this? And it's not going to be like really annoying to do all this shit. And then my design ideas tend to be a lot tamer, and I sort of come in and I try and maintain, especially with Greed, I try to maintain as much of the gonzo bullshit as possible while still tamping it down until it was like a game that made sense and could be played. So like the Rhoda Priest being, I think, the prime example of gonzo bullshit, of like imaginary numbers and all of that. And there's a version of the Rhoda Priest, because the imaginary numbers are smoke and mirrors. It is the Rhoda Priest is a class who, instead of having normal stats, has a dial that goes from 2 up to 5 and then back down to 2. And that's represented in, I to the x equals -1, or I to the x equals 1. And it doesn't have to be. And that, I think, is like a lot of the game was stuff like that. So the design relationship is that we talk about stuff like that, and then I end up doing the actual writing of the game, and the illustration and the formatting and all that. Essentially, when we were dividing up the profits for the first time from Greed, we talked about how what I did with Greed was sort of like going into someone's broken house and then like fixing everything for them, but like you didn't ask. Like
in the dead of night, I guess, in this situation.
Well, like it's not that it was secret. It was just like I showed up and then fixed everything, or quote unquote fixed everything. I made everything such that it could be released and everything, but it would simply not exist. I wouldn't have had any of these ideas. The taverns, the jawbreakers, the bodkins, the magistrates, like that's all him. But it would never, ever have been released without me just sort of showing up and being like, I'm going to make this releasable. Because he didn't ask, he didn't say no, but he also didn't. It wasn't like I was being hired to do that. I was doing it because I thought I saw a good game that could be released and that people would like. In that document. So there, like, that was a strange consideration of like all that. But in the future, because we do plan on making other true collaborations, like All the Aces isn't necessarily a collaboration. It is just me inspired by Greed, which we made. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But there's some other stuff that is, if it ever comes out, it's a long way away, that was made in much the same way as Greed, where CXA has done a game and then I've tweaked it until I'm like, okay, this is, I think, how it might really work. And then I just have, he's a little hard to nail down. It's a little mysterious. So then you just, you got to wait until the faucet turns back on, and then you can start working again. But until then, until then, it's going to be back to just, Bubblegum Wizards, those sorts of games. Those are the ones that are just, or Nuclear Knights. Those are the ones that are really just me. With CXA gets the credit because we talk about design often.
Yeah, and that makes sense as a sort of
yeah.
That makes sense in the same way like you shout out things that influenced you. It makes sense to shout out people whose conversations with were important.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned like you leaving high school there, because I realized actually in the way we've sort of bounced around a bit, skipped that you're currently a full-time student. I wondered if you wanted to talk a bit about what you're studying and how you feel that does or doesn't come into your work.
So yes, I'm a full-time student, and I'm currently studying creative writing and urban anthropology. And I think that though certainly, I think you can maybe tell. I think especially with Psychopunk and the Bubblegum games, uh, I'm like the fascination with urban space is big in those, and I want it now that I feel like I know a lot more about that sort of thing. I've had a strong compulsion to sort of go back into those worlds and do something again, do something more interesting this time maybe. But I think the creative writing is the most obvious. Like, um,
Yeah.
these are things, or when I write something, I want to really write it, not just like have it be words. Um, and I think I don't know. There's a lot of I think voices that I read for school that find their way into the games. Like, I mean, one of my favorite writers right now, naturally, is Thomas Pynchon, and GREED is like a Thomas Pynchon game. It's sort of embarrassing. In the same way that I know Neil Stevenson and William Gibson, or maybe just one of them. I remember reading on Wikipedia one of them saying that Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon was the quote unquote Old Testament of cyberpunk, which is a batshit thing to say. But when you have read Gravity's Rainbow and then you read, fucking Snow Crash, it's like, Christ. They like Neil Stevenson was doing a Pynchon impression, um, and it's so hard not to. Um, yeah, I think that a lot of there are books, like we're writing books,
Yeah.
like we're selling books, and I think that the creative writing comes into that at all times, and that writing games also informs other disciplines, my other writing, where you have a whole language of complete, often second person command, in which there is a stress on economy of words and clarity of words, where like there's such exactitude in terms of say there's an ability that lets you fly in a game. How much do you say? How much do you leave to implication? Because in something like Dungeons and Dragons, your fly spell is going to have to specify how fast. When does it end? When does it do this? When does it do that? Like that, there's all of these parameters that theoretically you would want to get into. But in a game like Greed, I believe the fly ability is like you can move in any direction or something. Like there's something like that sort of understanding of how much the audience needs to know and how much can be left to implication, which is a constant battle if you look at the comments section of any sufficiently popular game.
Yeah.
What works for one person is not going to work for another person.
Yeah,
But
I definitely have
finding
seen loads of comment
that,
exchanges where it's people being like, "Oh, what did you mean by this?" And the answer being like, "Oh, it was intended ambiguously. I
right.
can't give you an authorial answer."
Yeah, like that's and that happens a lot in creative writing too, especially if you do workshops and shit. One of those classic like, well, what happened to this character? It's like, well, I didn't tell you. like like that. well, what happens if I such and such rules thing, and it's like almost always. I mean, I almost a lot of time if you're asking, I probably should have told you, but like sometimes I didn't tell you on purpose. Um, yeah, and I think that that is like the road goes both ways um, in terms of creative writing influencing. What games are creative writing, so it feeds itself Ouroboros style.
Yeah. Like, yeah. When I was also teaching, I noticed how games affected teaching because I think if you're grappling with language, even if it's in lots of different contexts, it's sort of impossible for it to not start bleeding through into other areas where that's something you play with. And I think of you as a creator with a very strong voice.
Thank you.
I really love the stat list in Greed, and partly it's like, oh, I so understand every stat, even though they are not like the big obvious ones you get in a lot of games because of how you've explained them. And I remember reading, I think, even just like the opening of all of the aces after like the influences section and going like, yeah, I get where we are, and that's been accomplished just via language. So what moving now on just from like the fully loaded compliments, I was curious how, and I get a sense already from what we've talked about, like how consciously you're considering your voice. It does sound like you're a creator who, yeah, thinks about the words you're using. And I guess I also wondered what you think might have fed into it. Do you feel like you are, having to resist the edge of doing a pinch and impression?
I think, especially with things like all the aces and greed, the voice is doing so much that you like it has to have a voice because otherwise I'm going to need 500 more words or no 500 more pages. 500 words is nothing. 500 more pages in this rule book. uh like if you have, say, a short story that takes the form of a recipe, and as soon as it starts and says we're cooking chicken, whatever the fuck, and then it has a list of ingredients, there's so much already in terms of word economy that we understand in terms of where we are, what we're doing, where we're going, who is talking, who they're talking to. And that's really just accomplished with a defamiliarized, very particularized voice, which is the recipe book. And I think to a lesser extent, something like All the Aces, which takes place in this very particular noir, but like European noir, post-war sort of thing, um, you get so much more through implication and voice than you would through another 10 pages of listing what the city is or where we are, what the history is. And I think, especially pulp stuff, the implication is its power. I love that if I'm imagining being alive to see the original Star Wars movie, and I hear them talk about the Clone Wars, what the
Yeah.
fuck is that? Like, were you fighting yourself? That's so sick.
Yeah. It's now
But
interesting
that's
because you saying that about noir has made me wonder, wow, how would the opening narration of The Third Man read to a person who never knew what World War II was?
right. It's which was so I just like all the aces was I had made Greed and then I rewatched The Third Man and I was like, shit, I'm gonna make this. And then like a week later there was a working, prototype. And
It's a
like
powerful film in terms of
it
watching it and
is.
being like, I need to go and make something out now.
Yeah, Orson Welles. But the I think also in Greed, you have so much I think I think the voice in Greed has so much to do with authority in a way that all the aces and Bubblegum Wizards and these things don't necessarily need. Because, especially all the aces, I think of the voice as having a lot of like, yeah, do whatever you want, man. See, like, there's something sort of hands off about it. Whereas I think Greed is so bizarre and it asks you to learn so many new weird shit that its voice there is certainly I would say in most fiction a linear relationship between the strangeness of what you're saying and the necessity for the author to establish their authority as someone who knows what they're talking about. Where if Greed didn't command you and say, this is how it is, deal with it, then it would, I think, be liable to really lose you because it would give you opening to be lost. Whereas it's only asking you to, follow by its like loaded gun. It's not, it's not really asking. It's just taking you someplace. Um, and I think that sort of voice is really like that. It's a primary consideration for the games and what they need and what they're saying. There's a game that I've been working on that may or may not ever come out. This is the other CXA game. That's a pirate game, and I'm looking
Oh, hell
forward
yeah.
to in rewriting it eventually. Like how many sort of like Anglo-Saxon short words can I possibly put in here? Um, of like this sort of pirate game. They're not. I don't want to use a word like discipline. How French, like like flog. I can do flog, but like like that's and that would I think it's subtle, but it really that would help you get into a pirate game. If we're spelling gruesome with an EW, we're in it in a way
Yeah,
that
we're in a different place now.
the EU, forget it. That's not pirates.
Yeah. I remember when I was writing Terminal, because it was a hack of Inevitable where the an individual session is called a quest, and I was like, well, I can't call this a quest. This doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
We're like digital pirates, and then someone I think the immediate suggestion people threw at me was like, call it a mission, and I was like, no, because I think mission implies military.
Right.
And so I went with Operation partly because of what was also a computer pun, but I was just like,
Right.
it's interesting thinking about what you're saying about authority, because I'm like, authority can manifest in a voice in a lot of different ways, and I'm like, the authority in the voice in Greed doesn't care about you because it
No.
comes from a world that doesn't care about the people who live there.
Right. And I think there's something really powerful about a lot of art that I love where it sort of establishes that it's going to be doing its own thing over here and you can come and meet it if you want to, but if you don't, no problem. Like that I feel this way while I think there's probably a better example somewhere in my mind, but I felt that way last time I watched The Godfather. It's so long and like into itself that it just feels like at some point it goes, we're going to be doing The Godfather over here for the next 3 hours. Take it or leave it, man. Like it's so sure of itself that and I really appreciate that in art. I think that sort of self assurance is very attractive in art. Um, and that it needs to be, if it is doing something strange, I think it's got to ask you to buy your own ticket um, to get on the ride because a lot of people and a lot of big art, like if I was forced to read Greed, I might not like it because I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's long enough to really be like totally grating, but there's something I think really about stuff that's really trying to do something that it's like, if I'm not here on purpose, then this gets whack. And
Yeah.
so establishing that it's like, hey, come and go, but like I don't even fucking give a shit that you're reading this book.
I don't care if you're here or not. Yeah, it's it's so much more appealing to something that is either apologizing for itself,
Hmm.
or is self-conscious about the reader's reaction.
But I
Like, is
think it is.
self-conscious about a reader who might be put off.
Absolutely.
It
But
feels
I think subtly throughout Greed, I mean, so much of it is really intricately, maybe even too, like, strangely considered in terms of, like, I do want people to read this. I do, it
yeah.
really does care that you're there. It's just putting on this affectation. I think the silliest, clearest example I can think of off the top of my head is that stat list where it goes in order, I think, strength, Omond, Zeitgeisthood, and Yer. And we thought a lot about that order because we have strength, which is okay, yeah, normal word. Omond, okay, it's French, but that's a word. Zeitgeisthood, a part of that is a word, but that's not
Yeah.
a word. That's a new thing. And then Yer, which is a word, but no one knows the word Yer. It might as well be completely made up. Yer is, if you don't know, it's how fast boats can turn. Um, and there's like I think that is the sort of that's the on ramp of the four stats of like if we hit you with Yer first thing, then
And then go
you're I
and
don't
then just
know.
leave them at strength at the end. That would, yeah.
Yeah, I don't, maybe that would be funny in its own. Like we got Zorbagob, we got Schmoobalob, and then strength. Um, but
Yeah, as a
but I
punchline, it works, but yeah,
right.
I don't think you'd suddenly feel like you know what's going on more. Whereas, yeah,
No,
ramping up via strength.
yeah, like and strength is such a basic stat that I think it makes it a lot funnier that when it's alone in like the strength and then some random bullshit. Um, yeah, but there's a lot of stuff like that that is like in the class list of like the simplest classes come first. It never says that, but they're not in alphabetical order. They're in complexity order. Bodkin is the simplest, and then Magistrate kind of, and then certainly Goblin and Rotopriest are the most obscure, so they go at the end because you don't want to overwhelm people. Um, so there's a lot of those sort of like invisible considerations of the voice can say one thing, but in the end, the product does really care about your experience reading it. I don't want you to have trouble reading it. I don't want it to feel too strange. Um, so there's a lot of those sort of like, I guess, arranging these strange deck chairs in ways that make as much sense as they can, uh, just in
Yeah.
case.
A teaching term we had often about, like, this is going to sound. No, actually, it won't. It will sound maybe slightly pretentious, but it
It'll
was
sound great.
the zone of proximal development may have been my memory of it. But it was basically an
Uh-huh.
idea of like you're about like this sort of like sweet spot of feeling challenged when learning, when it's like, oh
Mm-hmm.
yeah, if you are teaching a lesson and a kid is bored and they tune out, that's because they weren't challenged. But also if it was too challenging and they went, I can't do this, I don't know what I'm doing, they're also going to check out, so you're hitting that sweet spot. And then another thing was there is like you're often trying to scaffold people up to push further, and it just put me in that mind. There's a lot of invisible scaffolding that, as
That's
people
a
get
really
more
great,
familiar, can
yeah,
fade away.
that's a really great phrase. I like that. I'm gonna think about that now.
Yeah, scaffolding.
That is,
I think
yeah.
I sometimes use it in books and then go and have to remember to cut it because I it's not actually as common enough.
Hmm.
So an interesting thing I liked in all of the aces, and I also a big reason I really liked it is because I had also thought of doing it before, is you label the sort of traditional like player the actors. And I guess that got me wondering, like, do you have much of a relationship or appreciative stuff of live performance, and does that come into your work at all?
Yes, I was surprised. Um, when you had sent me this question, because I had not thought that this would be obvious based on my work that I had done this, and I was like, "Whoa, what the hell?" Um, yes, so the players are called actors in all the aces, and that's so I used to do sketch comedy writing and acting, like stage comedy, and I still like acting. I just don't do it really. Uh, and I have long thought that playing TTRPGs is acting, and that's why it's fun. Is just like this weird version of identifying with a character outside yourself, or identifying with yourself in this new set of rules and like playing around in that space. I think that's acting, um, and that and there's yeah, I think that there's a really, I think, sort of not cosmic, but big connection between play and acting, if they're any different. Like, just the basic idea of being a player in a game, I think, is acting a role. Even in chess, you are operating on rules that are not the rules that you operate on in your day-to-day life. You're operating in a world in which the rook moves one way and the bishop moves another way, and there it doesn't feel like there's a lot of room for characterization in something like that. But that's there in other games that it's much more obvious. Um, I think that like playing a TTRPG, I have often found I don't like playing with a one-on-one. Generally, sort of a bigger group I like more, because we are each actors in a TTRPG, and we are all each other's audience as well.
Mm.
Where I feel like I don't, whatever I did in a TTRPG, if it was sick as hell, I don't feel like it happened unless there's like three people there to see it. Because I needed an audience. Like if I did something, or if some crazy thing happened in a game that I thought was just awesome, but it was just me and the person running it, like it's cool, but I want more. I think that I
In the hit of a crowd.
right, like I think that it's interesting that we really do get to be these dual, like when you're talking, you're the actor and everyone else is the audience, and then the role switches, and it keeps switching. Um, yeah, I think that they're heavily intertwined, and certainly
Yeah.
that's my ethos when I run it. I don't know exactly how much that comes out in the games that I do, or that I write, but that's certainly how I imagine it.
And I imagine to some extent, like, the way you run stuff probably must then go on to a lot of design, even in ways that are probably harder to realize because it's all of the, like,
Those basic
assumptions of
assumptions,
just, like,
yeah.
this is how I go around it. But yeah, it was interesting because it was making me also just wonder. I'm curious if player as a term referring to the player of a game
Hmm.
comes after player as an actor.
Right. Yeah.
I
To
don't
be
know,
in a
but in my
play.
mind, I'm like, games, more codified games might be like later. I could look it up, but I'm just like, yeah, they feel very intertwined as a concept, but obviously it's what sort of lens you can see stuff through. And I like it. I like the choice of labeling the player and actor, partly because I think when a lot of people will talk around stuff of like making sure that the GM figure also feels like a player. And I
Hmm.
remember often thinking like, yeah, I don't think like GM's the problem term so much. The problem is that we
Hmm.
call only one kind of player the player.
Right. I think I think that there's also an extent to which, in all the aces, particularly, you call them the actor, because it's identifying itself much more closely with movies than a lot of the other games. So you have like a director and actors. I think the main guy, the runner is called the director. I'm not positive.
I think it's the
Um,
dealer.
The
It
deal,
must have
yeah, it's totally
changed.
the dealer. That's better. I'm glad I thought of a better one. um, I yeah, there's something, we're talking about movies and detectives. I think I want you to be doing a voice. I want you to be like feeling that you're like a noir detective.
Yeah.
These sorts of things. Um, and there's also, I think, a similar like, and this was the CXA idea, but in Greed you have the Baron, and then it's like the players are in castes. Is there is the word, and there's like two castes of players, the Baron and then like the rest. Um, and that's sort of like and I think most games are awake to this because and I love that there's something um, you get so much characterization of your game from the words you use to describe things, and these are like basically naming your most fundamental nouns, um, which is a really important little decision.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because Bubblegum Wizards, it's the clerk. Or I
Yeah,
may be saying that wrong.
yeah,
And
yeah.
I'm like, the clerk as a character feels so much more as just an idea, feels like way more like on the same side as who the player
Hmm.
characters often are. Whereas the Baron doesn't. The Baron feels almost very opposed to definitely the way it's labeled with cast. The dealer almost feels like partway between, maybe. Like
Yeah,
if I'm thinking about dealer, it's like a lot of control, but also like the dealer is also an instrument of chance. They're not the director of chance.
I think dealer is like a fucked up clerk. It's like if a clerk
Mm.
could like a clerk is, I don't know, going to sell you something. Maybe will help you out if you're looking for something. But and a dealer will do similar things, but there's always, especially in a noir setting, an idea that they're trying to trick you somehow. Of like, you have to watch out for a dealer. You don't necessarily have to watch out for a clerk. Um, and you
Mm.
definitely have to watch out for a baron. A baron is up to no good. Uh,
It's like a dealer also implies an area. Like a clerk implies a
right,
shop, a dealer implies a casino. And
right,
one of those places has much more nefarious intent for you. I don't know
right.
why I phrased it that way.
And I think it's just fun to have naming conventions like, oh, all the aces, and then there's dealers. Oh, we're talking about cards, etc., etc. Like,
Yeah.
it's good sometimes to take the low hanging fruit.
It's fun. I think the only reason I don't have a fun name in Terminal is partly just because all of the character antagonist characters are named the blank, and I'm like, I feel like it may
Hmm.
have just caused confusion. But
Yeah,
I always found it
that's
interesting. Yeah,
interesting.
like yeah, I worried it would be
Oh,
a.
you
The thing
froze
is, the
my
obvious
throat.
option for Terminal would be the director, and there's a character called that.
Right. That's, I think, that's really interesting when you have a game so full of proper nouns of
Yeah,
the that it that you can't. It ends up that you can't call somebody the X because then there's too many of them. I love that
yeah.
problem.
Bracket, like I don't want to add like brackets game. I did at one point consider for the director. It was an early writing thing, and then I banned it straight away, saying that like their physical appearance would have been the exact same as whoever was running the game.
Mm,
But as fun
I
as the
like
twist I
that.
was like, I think ultimately too many young trans people will run the
Mm,
game. And then the
right.
fact of like the a main overarching villain not being like an old cis white guy feels like off almost.
Could have been the person who's running. It could be like their dad. But
That would have actually been a fun choice. It's
I
always like,
think
please, if you're running the game, please pick the father figure or closest thing you have to a father figure that you have maybe the most tense relationship with.
I think there's something very Matrix about that. A very like
Yeah,
of a very Matrix sequels about asking someone to do something like that and being meta in that way. Um,
yeah.
yeah,
But and just while we're talking about all of the aces, I might jump to a different question I had for there
Hmm.
because it describes itself as a detective simulator. Its visual identity is super sort of noirish, and I was wondering when you're engaging in a specific like genre space, what are the sort of like hallmarks of that genre you're wanting to invite in, and I guess what perspective or what knowledge or background with that genre do you imagine a hypothetical reader might or might not have?
Well, I guess I'm preparing for either someone who's read every detective book and seen every noir movie and is reading this book, and I'm ready for them to say this isn't fucking noir. You have no idea what the fuck you're talking about. But I'm also ready for someone who's like, it needs to be ready for both that person and someone who has never seen any noir thing, and this is their first taste of any of it. Um, because I am not a huge noir head. I like Third Man and I like a lot of detective stuff, but I think, especially in the genre cocktail that noir is, there's a lot of stuff that All the Aces very deliberately omits, or adds. Like, it sort of, in my mind, imagines a subgenre of noir that, as far as I know, is only the Third Man. like like it just imagines that that's a much bigger space to play in and
Yeah,
then plays in it. Or like Casablanca also is a touchstone of that sort of like, um, occupation being a big thing of like, in this noir story, it doesn't really give much of a shit about like, dames or femme fatales. Like, that's just not really a
yeah,
thing because everyone's like, there's no horniness. They've been bombed. Like, I think that's such a rich, noir ground. That's like, you have movies like, the American noir stuff that was coming out back then in the 40s or whatever, 40s, 50s, like Detour. I don't love those movies. Um, I I think that there's something really compelling about that nihilism, and really, I guess that already fit. I felt the mechanics of greed, where like the reason that I like the greed combat is that, it disincentivizes combat, and it's easy to fit on one page. Um, and it's I think fun, um, and in a way that in detective stories, you want to be like, you want that tension of, if there's a guy with a gun in the alleyway, that's fucking scary. Like, you're a detective, you're not shooting people. That's not your thing,
mm,
unless you pointedly made it your character's thing. Like, in a detective story, you could die if you say the wrong thing. And that, I think, sort of necessitates um, a greed like thing. That genre, to me, I felt like, I haven't read a shit ton of other detective games, but that genre to me felt like it would be served by something that was scary and you could die quick, and it was, a short little thing. All the Aces is not a long game. It's significantly shorter
mm.
than Greed, um, and I don't know. There's less jokes. There's like it's just sort of here, being what it is, um, and I think that that's a lot to do with its, yeah, movie-ish genre sensibilities. Um, if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. I was a big noir fan, and also I remember like reading the first page of all the aces and seeing like Third Man listed there. It was like yes, because I was just like I love the Third Man. I did an adventure which was inspired by Third Man, and my friend was selling it at a convention and told someone that trying to as a selling point. and they
Hmm.
complained that my friend had spoiled the adventure.
Yeah, I had a beautiful time rewatching it because me and my partner, we like Orson Welles, and he didn't know that Orson Welles is in the movie. So I pulled it
Oh,
up and I
that's
just like
great.
skipped. It sucks to skip those opening credits because it's like the guitar and that's fun. But I skipped
Yeah.
the opening credits and I was just like, yeah, it's like this noir movie. I just want to throw it on. And like the
Oh,
whole
yeah.
movie. I mean, of course he guesses. Okay, fucking whatever. I'm spoilers for the third man. This
Yeah.
guy, this guy that they're like, he's dead. There's no way he's alive. This guy's dead. This guy's alive. And it's Orson Welles, and that's oh
Yeah.
my god, it's Orson Welles, and I love that. I love if you don't know it's Orson Welles, and it's like he's
Yeah, that's the
alive,
thing. I think
and
we're fine
huh?
to spoil it because it's impossible to track down and buy this film and not get the big
Right?
Orson Welles thing scene. You need
Yeah.
someone who is, yeah, running interference and skipping the credits for you to get that kind of surprise.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I just think that detect. Well, here's I think another thing about genre. Mystery is so uniquely predisposed to the TTRPG format. It might be, in my opinion, the single strangest, like, why are we writing fiction novels about this when we could be playing games? It's such a game medium. It's such a game narrative. Uh, and I feel like a lot of it's weird that it's not the main thing to me. It's so like you can actually interact with it in as many ways as the person who runs it can imagine. Um, that it can morph to meet you, and you can have all these characteristics, and you actually I don't know. It seems like the reason I think a lot of people like stuff like Agatha Christie and stuff is this identification with the characters and this a desire to help solve the mystery or to get there first or whatever. And the idea that you can really do that if the rules are good um, is, I think, really really cool. And this is, I think, it's such a powerful genre that I've been running mystery campaigns in like Nuclear Knights, which is just not built for it. Like but it's like it's so potent that I'm like I just can't resist. Every once in a while, you dip into that well because it's such a furtive well.
It's like the concept of a genre of a whodunit. That's a genre with a question, which is not actually how most genre titles are. Like it's clearly inviting this like not audience participation like TM, but like
Right.
a sort of active interrogation of the plot that maybe most other like kinds of genres just don't usually sort of call for.
Well, in a way that is like, say, kung fu movies. I love kung fu games. I love kung fu movies. Um, the thing they're doing is punching and kicking. That's the interesting thing they're doing. In a mystery, the interesting thing they're doing is talking to each other. That's what we're doing. Uh,
Yeah, the
like
literal
that.
thing.
Yeah, like it's a literal. The thing that we can most accurately represent in a TTRPG, the thing that we can most literally give you is a conversation. Because it necessarily sort of is a conversation regardless of what you're doing. Your kung fu fight is a conversation. So the fact that it's a genre built on tense conversations is like, and that's the genre expectation, is the tense conversation. I think it's so almost freeing to be like, you don't even, I think it's a shorter game because you don't need that many rules, because it's like
Mm.
I give you the scaffolding to make this conversation tense, and then you have it. Like I'm not, I don't need to roll dice because you're talking. It's literally what
Yeah,
you're doing.
it does. It fades away.
Yeah.
So yeah, we talked a bit about comic books before. You had your big Akira plan as there. And I guess I wondered about the influence of it. I enjoy the way the extended example of play is a full story that's like partially told through comic books. But I know you were talking there that you came to sort of realize like where your relationship with that was in terms of which way it was going.
Right. I mean, I think I still love comics, especially, I guess, manga. But I think that it's like animation. It's like I, in the past, have done both comics and animation. And I think the thing that's so beautiful, one of the things that's so beautiful about prose writing is that it's so cheap. You literally just need a computer and you can do it pretty fast. Whereas animation and comics are such collaborative mediums, unless you're a complete freak. Um, and I don't have that specific dog in me. So it's just like a I love comics and I love multimedia stuff. So in that greed thing, that's a big just. I think a warp would be cooler to be seen than read. But I don't know. I think it's just always good to try and be awake to the like not just in a piece or but within a piece. Uh, like in this scene, is this scene a play, a comic, or prose? Because you can swap between them and no one can stop you. Um, like, what is it best served by, or what medium does it want to be? Um, and I think that the actual sort of imprint, the meeting of odd or of visual and linguistic storytelling, which is I don't know, that's so interesting that we have these discrete categories of language and all these like the pure meeting of them being comics of like you can have words but you don't need them and all that sort of visual storytelling. I still really like to think about it. It's just a pain in the ass.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. As someone who also didn't have like illustrative, I wanted to be like a comic book writer, but I never figured out like an illustration thing for me. I think that this does bring us on to talking about illustration because you are the illustrator for your own games as well as the designer writer. The question I had written was like how intertwined for you are these elements. And I think through this conversation I'm getting the apprentice that like it seems to me it's what flows to you from the story. Or are there things where you come in? Do you find you're still like a visual thinker in terms of ideas?
I think I'm sort of distinctly not a visual thinker. Um, Usually, I will write a game, finish it, and then go, "Oh, guess I gotta draw some shit for this." like, uh, especially with like Greed or Bubblegum Wizards. Um, there are visuals to it, but the visuals are mostly there because I know it's not as interesting without visuals. Like you gotta have something. Uh, and then once you're putting them in, it's worth it to really, you know, don't half-ass the visuals. Like the visual identity of Bubblegum Wizards and Bubblegum Vampires and Greed and Psychopunk are all pretty highly considered. Um, but they're definitely ancillary. Uh, I don't like. I think the visual identity of something like All the Aces, like that, is mostly photography, and it's also a lot of public domain um, paintings that have been run through filters. Um, and the photography is because it's easy. And I have a projector and I have a light box in my apartment and I have a white wall. Um, and so we play dress up and take pictures and then edit them until they're black and white. And like that sort of because of the genre, that is sort of allowed in my mind to suffice for a visual identity. Like it's already got the black and white stuff. That's noir and high contrast. That's noir. Um,
I always
the
think for
only
noir, there's something in my mind where I'm like, oh yeah, I mean, noir's got flesh, so photography makes sense because
Right.
noir is fleshy was the thing that went to my mind.
I don't think noir is fleshy. I think noir
Really? In my
is
mind?
like bricky,
Like,
clay.
I guess bricky, yeah, but I guess I mean like fleshy as opposed to like
It's got, well, put it like
sort.
this. I can imagine a photo on the cover of a noir novel much easier than I can imagine a photo on the cover of a fantasy novel. I don't mind it
Yeah,
in the noir. I like pictures of
I
real
think in noir,
people
like
as
I think it's
noir.
bruise.
Yeah, I
I think
guess,
also
yeah,
because
I could see
it's
that.
a. I think also what we've like got away from the thing of like, oh yeah, it's a film medium first, so sticking
Hmm.
with photography, yeah,
Yeah.
makes sense
Whereas
from
like
there.
Bubblegum Wizards, it's like I own a trench coat that whose collar I can pop, and that's so I can do noir in the way that Bubblegum Wizards I could not take photos of me and my friends and it looks like we're Bubblegum Wizards. Like I'm just
Yeah,
same thing with Greed. Like there are some photos in Greed, but they're like edited photos of the New York subways and stuff, because that's the only thing that it's like it looks like tunnels and pipes and shit. Like Greed needs more abstraction because it's a fantasy game, it's a sci-fi game, and of course things like Nuclear Knights are just better served by illustrative, like I don't know, hot people with swords. Like that's just you know that's anime boy with blood on the face is
yeah.
literally all my thumbnails, um, on itch because I don't know. Maybe it's superstition, but I think it works. I think
It's a winning formula, see.
people come for the anime guy with some blood on his face. Although I do want to put out there,
The
I want to make it more known. The greed guy, is the butch lesbian in the comic. Um,
yeah,
yeah, so just clearing the air there. We gotta put that out there so the people know.
the
It's the greed
people.
lesbian.
Yeah, the GREED Lesbian. We got to make this specific if this is what we're accomplishing with the podcast.
Absolutely.
I remember I
Greed
had a lot of
fans
fun
need to get
working
in
on.
line. Okay, go ahead and get in line and align with my. You gotta call it the greed lesbian, not the greed guy. I've had enough.
This is transphobia if you call it the GREED guy.
Yeah, in the next Greed story, it's going to be revealed that, like, well, actually, hormone replacement therapy is in the game of Greed. I just remembered that.
Yeah,
Yeah. Anyways,
I remember, that was good because I had a lot of fun working with you as an illustrator, and I guess did you approach that mentally like very differently then? Because obviously there was it was less you going, I've got these spaces, I figured this out. It was more me saying, I want this.
yeah. I mean, I really like sort of switching modes like that, where I like knowing what I'm doing in terms of like if I'm my own boss with my own games, then I can dawdle or I can do this or that. But I really like being a sort of you know, I like that you just give me instructions and then I do them. And so, like that. It of course the door was always open for sort of collaboration, but I really liked just, especially with illustration, to just be handed a set of instructions and then execute them. Um, where I think that's not how I think of my own games at all. Where there's that illustrating someone else's game is so much about trying to be, I guess, attentive to the master's needs, like instead of like trying to ascertain your own game's needs, which feels, I think, a lot more um, like cynical in my mind. Like when I'm thinking of the art in the game, usually I'm thinking of like how little art do I really need, or like, does it need to be in color? Does it need to be this or that? Whereas when you're getting, paid to illustrate something, it's like, I want to make this nice. I want to make this good. I want to make this, um, which, I was thinking recently, like, you know, Greed is in black. Greed and all the aces are both in black and white. I like this about them. It would have been way harder to make them in color. They probably should have been in color. Those, like, I think those games probably would have, or Greed probably would have made more money if it was in color. Um, which is,
I can see
maybe
that. Yeah.
like that. It's
All the
just
aces, I'm like, no, I disagree. That should be black
no.
and
All the
white. But
all the aces actually that needs to be black and white. But yeah, maybe, I don't know, maybe in 100 years there'll be a Greed deluxe edition, print run, gloss cover, foil interiors.
yeah,
Yeah, but today's not that day.
it's all the
Uh,
weird considerations, and yeah, like what can I do today? What makes it easier for me to get this out? Because like you know, finishing's great. It's great to
right.
finish something and share it. So and sometimes, yeah, like all of the equations of like how am I getting this done makes
And
sense.
even when my games have had color, Bubblegum Vampires, Bubblegum Wizards, and Nuclear Knights all have like 5 color palettes where it's like the whole game is like black and then I think 5 colors. Um, and that's just to make a coherent visual identity throughout illustrations without busting my ass. Like it's pretty close to operating in black and white when it's illustrative, fill in the not like there's not a lot of shading, it's just flat colors, and they are these 5. This object is going to be one of these 5 colors, and that
Yeah,
helps it. And then the text is that color, and it helps it pull together. And I mean, Psychopunk is essentially monochromatic. It's black and green, um, but yeah, I think that like the art in my games is very utilitarian. I think, um, which maybe it shouldn't be. Like I would like the idea of a game in which the visual identity is completely essential to the function of the game, um, but like I just it hasn't happened yet.
I guess the thing of meeting any idea where it was, there are things I've done in my mind where I'm like, oh yeah, no, like the visual identity of here needed to be like small and like scrappy and that
Hmm.
versus oh the visual identity needs to be wide. And I was wondering about Greed because like yeah, Greed, you've got illustrations, you've got photos, you've got like the HB Bateman cartoons and things opposed to sort of in-universe advertisements. Like to me, the visual identity of Greed felt like not quite maximalist, but it felt expansive in how much stuff it brought in compared to like Wizards, Vampires, and Nuclear Knights being like
Hmm.
their illustration compared to all of the aces focusing exclusively on these photography. And I know you talked about like yes, ease in some cases, but like it does feel like they're all meeting the projects where they are.
Yeah, I think it's utilitarian, but not to the extent that it compromises any sort of artistic vision. And I think Greed in particular has to be that big because I think a lot of Greed is a part of its identity is that a lot of it's diegetic. Like it starts with the poetry that comes from in universe, and it's like every once in a while I would just have an idea for like one of my favorite parts of Greed is the double page spread of just like 2 books in the world, and one of them is like this modern sort of like nice cover that's called Warping with Your Eyes Open, and it's got like 10 authors, and then the other is like a
Yeah.
leather bound simple book that's just called Warping with Your Eyes Closed volume 14 or whatever. And that like the idea that this imply like I love diegetic bullshit like that implies like that there's some sort of ongoing scholarly debate between Warping with like is that literal? I kind of love if it
Yeah.
is. I love the
If
idea
it is
that
just
Warping with Your Eyes Closed is like the woke thing to do in the Greed universe. Like, I think that there's something I don't know, and in order for it to be diegetic, it must have a lot of different things going on, because sometimes there are just book covers that are leather, and sometimes there are posters that are illustrative, and sometimes there are photos that are of things that are really happening. On the negotiators page, I think there's a painting that it attributes to a particular painter in the Greed universe, and then
Yeah,
there's a
I had to look that up to find if that was a public domain thing by a real painter before I asked you about
no,
this or not. And then I
that
was like,
was
that's not a
yeah,
real name. Okay.
no, that was CXA made that, and the other, and then the photo is just like Photoshop, and then grain turned all the way up, uh, and that sort of thing. I think there's, if not maximalistic, certainly there's an aspect of collage. The original Greed cover was this incredibly dense collage that I just could not make readable. um, and then eventually it got simplified until the current cover, which is just the sort of like fiery engine looking thing, and then the name Greed and the oil symbol. Um, and so I think that the whole thing really does like, because Greed is a long game, and it was the first game also that I formatted with whatever it's called, something Affinity, with
Affinity, I think, right?
Affinity 2. All the other games were, Lord forgive me, Google Docs, and
That's so wild to me because I assumed like, oh yeah, no, this has got to be because I do not think the layout of Bubblegum or Wizards or Nuclear Knights is the kind of thing where you're like, oh yeah, probably Google Docs.
well, thank you. I mean, I think I got pretty good at Google Docs, but it's like
Mm.
it's Google Docs, like, and I think
Yeah.
that there's an obvious difference when you get to Greed, of the sort of like, the visual identity is expanded because the tools are expanded. It's the most recent game, um, and I think All the Aces is only not as expansive because it's less wacky. Um, it's got more of a particular thing going on, and it doesn't have as many pages, and it doesn't have as specific a world. Um, yeah.
It understands, yeah, like it's tighter essentially.
Hmm.
I know this, I guess, relates to a thing we were talking about earlier of like specificity of language, because I think there's something so interesting in like the signifiers around different names for magic users, and I was wondering what brought you to bubblegum like wizard specifically. And I guess then a related thing, I was wondering like there is like magic that is featured in multiple of your games, and do you have like your personal idea of like magic and fiction, or is it always saying like what's most interesting in this project?
I think it's generally what's most interesting in this project. That being said, almost always the answer is like wizards, um, because wizards are just sick as hell, and like I had never really considered any other name for the Bubblegum Wizards guys. The Bubblegum Wizards is a the thought process of that game starts at a card based something, like something about a TCG that is in a game, that is like, I don't know, I summon Blue Eyes White Dragon and then a fucking dragon shows up, and like for real. Um,
Yeah.
and I think that it must move away from that because it's such a scary thing to try and make. And every once in a while, I get caught again on that idea of like, what if for real I made a game that in which the resolution mechanic was a TCG, was a trading card game, and every time I have to be like, I'm not gonna like. It's so much work. I just can't do that. But Bubblegum
I
Wizards
get
sort
the
of ends
siren
up
song though.
right. But Bubblegum Wizards ends up being then this compromise in which it's like I have this idea of like people who cast cards, and then I don't know, it's just they're wizards. Like it's sick that they're wizards. If they were cardomancers or whatever, um, that's just bubblegum cardomancer. That's kind of sick.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Wizards, I think, have real they have they have cultural appeal in a really big way. I'm just always excited to see what Wizards are up to these days, because they're so expansive, especially I don't know in the year 2024. That Wizards have
Yeah.
never been up to more, and
Yeah, Wizards are definitely like having, a small moment.
right, and I think in Nuclear Knights, like I think with the idea of wizardry in fantasy specifically, I think I like to be treated with sort of deference. Where in Nuclear Knights, there's not a wizard class, but there is in the way Nuclear Knights works is that there's classes and disciplines are essentially a second list of like big suites of abilities that you can spec into, and wizardry is one of those. But you can't start out as a wizard; like you have to earn it, and then they're super powerful. But sort of in general, I think like of the biggest example, I guess, would be Bubblegum Wizards as opposed to Bubblegum Vampires, in which uh, vampires have magic too. It's just completely different magic, um, because it doesn't serve the game to have them be wizards. Um, and in Greed, there's magic, but we don't call them wizards. We don't call like there's Fireball, but wizards don't cast them. I guess there's XP mages, but it's very vague why they're called mages. Um, and that sort of thing. Like I think that magic is really just especially in games in which you have to have rules about something at some point, maybe. Certainly, my games have rules. There's something about there's the things that are possible, and then there's the other shit. And I think All the Aces might be the only game I've made that explicitly does not have any supernatural elements. Um,
Mm.
like, there's no wizards, there's no lasers, there's no psionics, there's no, it's just detectives. Um, but, that doesn't mean there isn't magic. Or rather, the magic is just flavored differently. In one game, I might have called something teleportation, but in this game, you would call it like you're sneaking around or whatever. It's like the fucking moment, my favorite goddamn stupid moment in Indiana Jones 3 when Indiana Jones is running in a train and he gets to the caboose, which is full of magic equipment, and then he gets in the trunk of the magic equipment in the caboose of the train, and the bad guys show up and they open the trunk, and he's outside the train and running away. Like that's magic. He just did real magic. Like they don't have a hole sawed out the bottom of the train, but it's like because of genre conventions, he has this
Yeah.
ability to if you can't see him, he can teleport. Um, so like, but we don't
The
call it
closest
magic.
thing to magic in All the Aces is movie magic.
Exactly. We can do movie magic in all the aces. Um, yeah, and it's just why, like, what's the difference between a mind control spell and paying $10 to tell someone this isn't your problem anymore or whatever? Like, it's just flavor. And sometimes a game is best served by that flavor being badass wizardry, and sometimes it's best served by being um, detective work, money speaking, etc.
So many of your games have different economic systems. There is the bank sweat thresholds at play in Bubblegum Wizards 2. There's the SD system for street cash and credit in Greed and Aces. As well, like Greed specifically having like sense a bit of like taxes, fees, and tariffs. I was wondering what thought goes into devising like the best system for each project, and definitely specifically with Greed, I feel it's like so well pitched at evoking like fears and dangers and anxieties around like poverty and debt.
Well, thank you. Um, I think that in most of my games, it's pretty clear that there's some sort of preoccupation with with poverty. That is, I think it's such a useful, culturally understood fire that you can light under someone's ass to make them do something. Um, in all of these games, I think that the threat of debt and poverty is a really easily understood um, just mechanism that makes players do interesting things, uh, and in different ways. Whereas obviously in something like Bubblegum Wizards, it doesn't track specific coinage. It is a vibes based coinage
Hmm.
system, and that it like you can run out, and it's bad to run out, but it's still sort of it's based on an experience of spending money in which it's just sort of yeah we spent some money, and so the ticker goes up. Whereas greed, which is about money, um, needs you to be counting your pennies, um, or else like sort of the whole thing is like uh, absurd OSR. I think is its main design ethos, and it's like, oh, you want to count coins? Yeah, we're gonna make you count coins. Like you want to go into dungeons and kill people and plunder and then sell it in town? Yeah, you're gonna do that. Um, like you're gonna do that more than you've ever done that before, and like so it must have a debt system, it must have a credit system, it must be completely preoccupied with money. um, and I also think this is an interesting thing of CXA's, that the greed world came into being exactly in tow with um, the ideas of mechanics of like I think the greed world, what interests me about it so much is that the economy is so purpose built to be in a game that that is about needing to do shit because you don't have any money. Um, like from the very ground up about the taverns and the demons and oil and burning and the plero realm, like the it is very video gamey in the way that its mechanics inform its world and vice versa. Um, but then in something like All the Aces, and this was another idea from CXA, All the Aces has a I found pretty elegant when he wrote it two currency system of a stock die for just like there is vibes money where there's just so much of it that yeah I'll just roll a die when I spend some, and then there's penny pinching money because that one's worth a lot more, um, which I think is like I just think that's a cool, and b you have in things like Casablanca and the Third Man there is this clear like if you're trading cash it's sort of lame. If you're like, I'll give you $30 to do this thing, it's like, I wish you would have given me like a pack of cigarettes. Like that says so much more about the world if we have to trade objects. So in the way that like the paper cash is defamiliarized into a dice roll, but then there's like coins that are worth a shit ton. Once you have those coins, those become interesting because there's not many of them. Then it's not like here's
Hmm.
$30, fuck off, and it's like okay, I guess it's $30. That's probably meaningful. It's like here's a cool coin that we all know we have to pay our taxes in these coins. So it's it's meaningful. It's like sort of a promise where it's like if I you need two of these coins by the end of every week to pay your taxes. So if I don't have, if I'm giving you one and now I don't have two anymore, that's an elegant narrative promise to be like, now I need to do this. I need to either get that back or I need to get a coin some other way, um, which is like these economic systems, I guess, yeah, are sort of self evidently based on the game that they're in necessarily. And then something like I guess yeah, freaking Bubblegum Vampires, Bubblegum Wizards, Bank Sweat, all that. Um, I think economic systems are just a good. It's like a dragon in fantasy. It's a thing you can just it's a card you can pull out and be like, watch out, you might run out of money, and everyone's like, oh shit, I know exactly what that means and what the stakes are usually, and it's
Yeah.
something that they understand
I think
generally.
there's also something to be said about the fact that it's the rare fear that can be as intimidating to an adventure in a fantasy world as it would be to you or me.
Right. And I think that it's also, I guess, there's something really juicy to me about the fact that I guess I really like making games about trying not to be poor, but never are they really about getting rich. Like greed
Yeah.
greed bills itself as something where you can get rich, but like, good fucking luck. Uh where like and that's sort of a part of the absurdity is that promise. But something like all the aces, the win condition is not the money. The win condition is buying your way out of the story, is leaving the narrative. Um, and that it's like, it's more like the economy in those games are much more about what you can lose than what you can gain. Um, which I think is when it's most effective, I guess, because really having money is having choice, and having choice is more interesting to me when it's not defamiliarized into currency. Um, like being a badass wizard who can cast a shit ton of spells is more interesting than being a rich guy who can buy a million things.
Mm.
But being having no agency I think is more interesting, I guess, or it's more clear when it's abstracted to the level of like, here is the number of things you can do. It is the number of dollar bills in your wallet, and there's not many of them. So then you have choice. You have to have whatever Sid Meier, God damn it, a game is a series of interesting choices. You know, it makes you do an interesting thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think also all the aces as well is just it brings me of that mind like to the third man, and I guess also other kind of genres, just where it's like, here is worthless cash you have loads of, and here is this cash which the fact of it, I think, also with like a city environment you've got where it's split between people, the fact of like, here is this one currency that matters more than all of the others says a lot about the world.
hmm yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
true.
So we are going to wrap up soon. Before I ask the my usual sort of standard wrap up question and stuff, I did want to also. I've seen a preview copy of all of the Aces. I really
hmm
love it. It's
Well, thank you.
it's a game, yeah, that I think for me just appeals so much about what I've loved about noir as a genre. Do you have a plan of when that might be coming out soon, or not that I know
Well,
when this is going out because I'm recording it in the dark.
right. Well, I can tell you at time of recording, the only thing that I have to do is finish an adventure for it, finish a mystery for it, format it, put it out. That could take me a week. It won't. It's probably in a couple months. Um, I'm going to go ahead and say it's what? It's about to be March. Let's say April. Let's put it out in April. All the
So
aces
I
coming to
this
you.
is
You
now
heard it
also a
here
great
first,
gamble
folks.
because I have all the Aces coming out in April, and for this to be meaningful, I need to get this podcast out before April.
Shit.
So we've now both set
But
ourselves up
listen,
these rotating challenges.
imagine whenever you're listening to this, just go ahead and check the release date on all the aces. That shit came out in April, didn't it? Yeah.
But yeah, and the place to find you, gormengeist.itch.io, and then
Yep.
you're also available on Tumblr.
I'm super available on Tumblr.
Available is an interesting choice of word. I don't know if it's the one I should have
Yeah,
gone
I'm
with.
always on Tumblr. Check me out. Hit me up.
Well, that was how
Everything.
we first connected. It was just by
Yeah.
virtue of me being a Tumblr mutual of yours.
Yeah.
And when I was looking for a person who I thought could do like fashion and style well and action well. And I was asking a friend of mine, and then I was like, wait, I have a mutual who might be perfect for this.
Well, thank you so
Yeah, thank
much.
you so much for coming on. What do you think? And this is my new sort of big wrap up question. What do you think is the biggest lesson you've learned from creating TTRPGs?
I think that especially when I first started making TTRPGs, I had this mind virus of like, as in a good mind virus, where you start noticing rules everywhere in your life and stupid rules, not like rules that don't make sense, but rules that don't do the things that the rules want to do. Um, and I think that there's something really beautiful about when making TTRPGs and really considering not just what a rule says, but what a rule does. Like how a rule interacts with the world around it and creates a vibe, whether it be through an economic system or just a suggestion on the part of a book that when you make rule books, you are stating a vibe for a group of people, theoretically, to literally do. Um, and that's like some real goddamn power that a rule book wields. And that, I don't know, rule books don't have to look like rule books. A lot of rule books don't look like rule books. Um, yeah. So I guess the thing that I've learned from TTRPGs is to be awake to the reality of a world that is made up of rules that uh, uh, might not be presented to you in a particular way about a particular thing, but do affect things that they don't say they affect. I suppose maybe that's a little circuitous, but it's true.
I get it. Yeah, I'm completely on board.
Hell yeah!
Yeah, this has been great. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
This has been the life path of Gormengeist. I've been Kayla Dice. Thank you for listening. Good
Thank
night.
you. Good night.